Hello, and welcome to the Red Feather Genealogy podcast. You might have to excuse my voice a little bit. I've been under the weather for a couple of weeks, but I'm functional enough, and I needed to get something posted, and I'm pretty excited about this new Ancestors series that I'm going to be doing. Rather than the older educational tutorial videos, I wanted to give some examples of some of the rock stars from my tree. A lot of genealogies are pretty straightforward, a lot of farmers, that kind of thing. My tree is full of a lot of moving and name changing and twists and turns and kind of abrupt surprises that have taken many, many years to sort out. And so I wanted to take some of the bigger names in the tree and give you an idea of what's out there, what can be found, how to go about finding it, more personal one-on-one examples of what you can do with genealogy. And I wanted to begin this series with my great-great-grandpa, King George. His name was actually George Hill, or was it? We'll be finding out shortly. This guy is a 3 or 4 part story, depending on how one looks at it. It's going to be working a bit backwards, so I hope all of this has some continuity ultimately and ends up making sense. Alright, so King George, as I love calling him because he had a few different names, so why not an illustrious one like that one? To my family, like most everybody else, he was a total unknown, and I mean a total unknown. He was my grandma's grandpa, beyond a name that she might have glanced at on her dad's death certificate because she didn't know him either. George Hill was kind of the beginning and the end of that line, and it didn't seem like there's going to be much to it. I found this, and there was a hint of things to come when I found him on the censuses listed as a capitalist. That could have meant anything, and it turns out it meant all kinds of things. So, I'd say my first step in this journey was getting the name, putting it on the tree, and then trying to unsuccessfully trace his ancestry, because he was up here in Oregon, specifically in Astoria, and then in Portland. And I didn't really know anything beyond that, except that he was from New York somewhere, and there was a rumor of Irishness because they were kind of sort of Catholic. All of this very, very vague, and I spent quite a bit of time, I would say 4 years, trying to figure out exactly where he came from in New York State. So the first step in figuring out what this spectacular, ultimately, character was about was I wrote to Astoria, up there to the Historical or Genealogical Society. I feel bad that I can't remember, but I've written to so many of these places. Anyway, I do remember that somebody named Lisa Penner got back to me, and oh man, you know, you write letters to places and people, and you just hope to get, you know, some little scrap of info or something, and what I got was an avalanche of a very, very naughty person. It turns out that George Hill ran a saloon in Astoria back in the late 19th century, and whatever ideas you have in mind of a wild saloon out west, that was happening here. It sounds honestly a lot like the movies. Hearing and reading about it, I couldn't believe that all of this was lost completely to the family, that nobody had heard anything about any of this. It was mind-blowing to me. There were shootings and stabbings and kidnappings and, prostitution and lots of beatings and all kinds of craziness going on. And the good part is, Lisa there sent me quite a few newspaper mentions and book mentions, and I'm going to be reading some of these off here. So, let's see. Much of the history of Astoria concerns the continual struggle between the church groups and the people who operated the saloons and dance halls. Astoria had a reputation of being controlled by the liquor interests. One of the bosses of these liquor interests was George W. Hill. As to being known as King George, apparently he got that name because, among other reasons, he was able to control the elections in Astoria by gathering men from near the riverfront, mostly transients, handing them out ballots that were already filled out and leading them to the voting place. Pretty clever, right? Alright, so that's the groundwork for what this guy was about. Let's get into some specifics here. Some of these ads, there are some things about these ads that are not exactly politically correct, and so I won't be reading them to a modern audience, but you'll definitely get the idea. Anyway, one of them was, in addition to the saloon, he had several other enterprises, which was what that broad heading of capitalism entailed. Russian baths. At the bathhouse on Astor Street, which are both open day and night, that's weirdly worded, with separate accommodations for ladies, the best Russian baths in the city can be secured at moderate cost and the best of treatment. Professional rubbers, I don't know if that was worded as well as it could have been, are in attendance, and private rooms for the night can be secured. George Hill, proprietor. January 3rd, 1904. Over here, we've got an ad for a bowling alley. Again, George Hill, proprietor. Entrance on Chenema Street, Astoria. I've never even been to Astoria. I'm sorry for anybody listening. I'm butchering your history. The best quality of wines, liquors, and cigars, and the best alley in Oregon. Well, wines, liquors, and cigars. That's quite a bit ritzier than a bowling alley I've ever been to. In addition to advertising in the papers, he got a lot of other advertising, usually in the form of getting arrested. And I still can't believe this guy's my ancestor. I love this stuff. If he was alive now, he'd be quite the scumbag, and he married into a lot of scumbags. But, you know, history tends to put a sheen on people sometimes, I guess. We do have an article here that is a bit sympathetic. Somebody wrote in, George Hill's variety theater in this city has been greatly abused by false reports. It is true that, quote, the crowd gathers there, and the patronage is a motley one, very like the days of '49, but there is nothing put upon the stage that smacks in the least particular of obscenity, nothing that could not properly come before the, quote, most fastidious. The plays are good, and patrons can enjoy them without molestation in private boxes. All right. Let's get to the good stuff. This one is from 1883. So we've got a coroner's inquest. That kind of sets the tone here, doesn't it? Edward Dickerson Baker, the young man who was stabbed in George Hill's saloon last Sunday morning, died at St. Mary's Hospital at 1 o'clock yesterday morning. A post-mortem examination disclosed the fact that the knife wound which caused his death penetrated the ileum and colon. A coroner's inquest was held at which the following transpired. Testimony of George Hill. Apparently I get to read my great-great-grandpa's words in front of the whole world, and that's pretty cool. I, George Hill, after being duly sworn, say I reside in the city of Astoria, county of Clatsop, state of Oregon, occupation saloon keeper in this city. Between 12 and 1 o'clock on the 13th of May, 1883, a little fellow by the name of Thompson and Hayes. Little fellow by the name of Thompson and... Okay. I guess that makes sense. I leave that up to you. Had some words together in my saloon. Hayes hit this man Thompson when Thompson let himself down on the floor and covered his head with his arms. Hayes made a kick at him while on the floor. I pushed Hayes away, when just then Baker came up on my right and said, "None of that." Baker struck out with his right hand to strike Hayes. Hayes backed up against the bar, Baker also backed off some. There's a big crowd of men standing alongside the bar when they all seem to make a move toward Baker. I turned to my right and caught hold of 2 or 3 men and threw them back. Looking to my left, I saw Baker go down on the floor on his right side, saw him clutch his hand to his stomach. He then jumped up and ran out of the saloon that leads to the restaurant. A man by the name of Harry Donut took hold of Baker, and I'm hoping that name isn't Harry Donut. That's what it looks like, I'll be honest. Took hold of Baker and took him into a room. I followed him up and asked him if he was hurt. He said he was cut. I asked him where, and he pulled up his shirt and showed me. I asked him who cut him. He said Joe Hayes cut him, but not to say anything about it. Well, I guess all Astoria heard about that one. Got another one over here, also from 1883. At an early hour yesterday morning, Leonard Chance, a young man of 20 or 21, was stabbed in the breast by a man who is said to be William Burberry and severely wounded. Chance was standing at the bar at George Hill's saloon and, it is said, was intoxicated and using abusive language to the barkeeper. His assailant came in and, leaning up against the bar, drew a knife and stabbed Chance in the breast, severing the cartilage just below the breastbone and inflicting an ugly but not necessarily fatal wound. Then turning, he made all possible speed out of the place, pursued by a crowd who finally caught him in Astor Street, just east of Cass. He was arrested by officers Stebb and Hunter, who were with the pursuing party, and placed in jail. He was brought before Judge Fox yesterday at 5:30. Alright. I'm just now realizing that 1883 must have been a very busy year for this guy, because we got another article. Circuit Court yesterday came up the Hill case on a writ of review. Sometime last March, George Hill was arrested for having women on the floor of his saloon. He was sentenced in the police court to pay a fine of $50 and forfeit his license. The matter was never settled, nor is it settled now, but Judge Bennett made a ruling yesterday that it has an important bearing on this much-talked-of case. I've been made to understand that the dancing girls were prostitutes, by the way, if you're wondering why on earth any of that would have been controversial. This one from 1882. At 3:30 yesterday morning, a man named Pass Smith shot and dangerously wounded William Robertson in George Hill's saloon. From a bystander who was present during the whole affair, we learned that the trouble began by Robertson having some words with another party in the saloon, and after considerable jawing they went up to the bar to take a drink. As Robertson was passing, Smith, who was employed in Hill's bowling alley, made a remark that he wouldn't drink with the man that had insulted him. This sounds just like the movies, doesn't it? Robertson took it up, and both he and Smith commenced growling at each other, finally proposing to fight. Smith struck Robertson, who at the time was starting to take off his coat, and who immediately buttoned it around him again, started towards Smith, who drew a small 7-shooter and fired, the ball striking Robertson in the side, about 4 inches to the right of the navel. The wounded man was at once conveyed to St. Mary's Hospital and medical aid summoned. Smith was arrested by policeman Hunter and taken to jail. Let's see, what else have we got? Another one from 1885, a fight at George Hill's saloon last night about 10:30 resulted in a couple of arrests, those that got the worst of it being hauled to jail, they singing in the merry moonlight as they went along. That is actually in the article. And finally, 1884, George Hill was arrested last Thursday night for running a saloon without a license and given a jury trial in the police court yesterday afternoon. The jury brought in a verdict of not guilty, which, under the circumstances, was about the only thing they could do. This guy was great getting in the papers. I've kind of wondered if sometimes maybe his own ads appeared alongside the ads of people getting shot or stabbed, and also the Shanghaiing thing. I guess this was a halfway common thing up on the coast, which was essentially just take a drunk and he would wake up on a boat and they would try to make him work or something. I don't know. Alright, so we've kind of established who he was. over here in Oregon. This, I'd say half of his life, this quarter of his life, I don't even know what to think of it. He appears, as far as censuses go, for the first time in 1880. The 1891 is pretty well shot. In 1890, there was a census of Union veterans across the North, at the very least. I don't think they covered all states, or all states' records didn't survive. I'm not even sure, but anyway, they would go around and it was a veteran census where they would ask, what companies or what regiments you were in, and if you got shot here and there, that kind of thing. And they got to him, and then it was left blank. And that was a huge mystery to me for years. Very frustrating. Because it indicated that he had, probably done something somewhere, but who knows. But don't worry, we'll be getting to that. In 1900, he's still in Astoria, in the red light district, known also as Swill Town. So that's nice. Let's see, as of 1910, he's in Portland. 1920, still in Portland. 1921, he dies in Portland, and apparently was more or less forgotten by a lot of people, but not everybody, as we'll be seeing. So this guy was very fascinating, but also a complete enigma. Like, who the hell was he? Where did he come from? What was going on with this guy? Something seemed very hidden, right? Well, this is where a second letter came in extremely handy. I've tried writing letters to a lot of people, a lot of places. Usually people don't respond. In the rare case they do, it's usually, I don't know anything, I don't have anything, And after a while it gets to be, kind of a grind to send these things out. But I did find a fellow descendant of King George, and he would be my third cousin-ish, something like that, this guy named Bill. And I sent him a letter, as always expecting nothing, and oh boy, he knew who George Hill was for the first half of his life, so that just blew the door open. Not only to where George himself came from, but of course his parents, and just, my online tree expanded very rapidly from there. But more importantly, he had pictures. I had no idea what this guy even looked like, and he sent me some pictures. And if you happen to be watching this on YouTube, which I suppose most people would be at this point, that would be him. I'm pretty sure that's him, somewhere around his saloon. Apparently no actual pictures of the saloon itself exist, which is strange and disappointing, but I'm thrilled to know what this guy looks like. So as to the other part of his life, well, it turns out George Hill was born Willard Germain. It's usually spelled German, as though he's German, which he isn't, but it turns out that the name had been something else before that. To make a long story short, this is one of those times where religion is a huge hint, because these people were kind of Catholic. And I don't mean that by, beating people up and then going to confession, that kind of thing. I mean, some of the kids may have been baptized, some of them weren't. I spent a lot of time looking. I don't think they were trying very hard, but they were known as Catholic, and it was assumed that they were Irish. It turns out, and this is going to make a long story very short, and I may have actually even mentioned this in the Haplogroups Revisited podcast, that I did eventually get the haplogroup of this line, which is G, and that runs dimly to France and pretty much not at all to Ireland. So I had a theory that the Germain line, it's kind of a mess, was actually French with the spelling that looks like gourmand. So that would be Germain, and then over here, Americanization, da-da-da-da-da. Anyway, the point is, Catholic French originally from the Catskills area of New York. So that was his origin, Willard Germain. So what's going on back there? Well, he was born apparently in 1841. I can't get an actual record on him, but allegedly 1841, Delaware County, New York. And as always, this stuff is pretty uninteresting back there, but don't worry, it picks up very quickly. 1862, he enlisted in Company C of the New York 177th Infantry Regiment at Albany. Yep, the Civil War. So it turns out this guy was in the war, as hinted at the blank 1890 veteran census much later. And the beauty of military records is they tell you where people are going and what they're doing. So before he was King George, George, then Willard, let's see, so he gets mustered in November 21st, 1862. They march to a railroad station in New York City, and they get on a steamer to go to New Orleans, and get some amazing kind of detail of them as they round around the Florida Keys, and they get back up into Louisiana here, and da-da-da-da-da. But May 15th, 1863 is where he finally really sees action at Port Hudson in Louisiana. Apparently he was one of the first to, as they say, draw blood. So he's fighting the Confederacy way down there. And a couple of other battles. Let's see. It's listing the actual full-on siege of Port Hudson as being May 25th, 1863. So skirmishes, minor battles here and there. Da-da-da. You get the idea. So then, back on the steamer, and round around Florida again. They stop, up and down the coast, that kind of thing. On one interesting little note here, September 28th, 1863 in Schenectady, New York. Doctor's note indicates that Willard was not at the regiment's mustering out as he was in the hospital for fever and diarrhea. These things happen when northerners went to southern climates. And then, he did something very, very interesting. I don't know what the story is here. There are so many blank spaces in this guy's epic. But in 1866, he actually re-enlisted. This was extremely unusual. We didn't have much of a military in this country unless we were actually at war. And even then it hadn't been very big. But the Civil War was colossal. And people wanted to get back to their lives as quickly as possible afterward. And so the military kind of abruptly just dropped down to a bare bones force after that. And most of that force was, of course, out west, either fighting the Indians there or in the south during Reconstruction, as a military presence allowing blacks to vote, that kind of thing. What he did in this enlistment exactly, I'm not sure. All I know is he was in Company F of the 1st Artillery, so apparently they trusted him with a cannon. This was January 29th. By July, he's discharged. And then in October, he's enlisted again. And then in May of 1869, he's discharged yet again. This all sounds very tedious, but believe me, this gets interesting. So now, 1869, he's in Maryland, in Baltimore. This is extremely important for our story because that's where he met his wife. She was part of the scumbag branch of my family, and there are actually historical records that say the same thing, so it's not like it's only my opinion. These were really, really bad people. And I kept wondering, a guy from New York shows up in Oregon, and he married somebody from Baltimore, and why would any of this happen? Well, eventually finding out that he was stationed down there, 23rd October 1869, Fort McHenry in Baltimore. And sure enough, he is right down the street from his future wife. He's in 4th Artillery, Company E. Apparently he's hanging out as a barber. It turns out that some of the stuff he was doing, the liquor sales in the bowling alley, he was doing some of that in New York around the time of the Civil War. So I guess he, was ahead of the game a little bit by the time he came out to Oregon. So February 21st, 1872, he marries his wife, Susan Ann Roten. Okay, Civil War is over, he marries her in Baltimore. What does this have to do with Oregon, right? It turns out that after marrying her, Battery E there was stationed at the mouth of the Columbia River. For those not familiar with the Pacific Northwest, basically that's the great big river that runs through the Pacific Northwest. Between Oregon and Washington, and Astoria and Fort Stevens are right out there by the mouth of the river. So there you go. That's the geography involved. So he's there at Fort Stevens, and now the Modoc War blows up. Quite a few very violent Indian wars were happening between the Civil War and the turn of the century. And the Modoc War, he ended up in, and this is where I hope all this is making sense with some continuity, because at the end I'll rehash it all in order. When I wrote to Cousin Bill, and he let me know about this guy's identity in the East, which let me put together the Civil War and all that, and his military enlistment from that coast. He also asked around, and years later, I can't remember if it was a sister or a cousin, I've got so much of this stuff bouncing around in my head, but he put me in touch with somebody else who knew a little bit more about this, saying that he was in the Modoc War. So all of a sudden all of this is coming together. And this brings me to April 15th, 1873 in Northern California. George, he had enlisted on this third or fourth enlistment, depending on how you look at it. I guess it would be the fourth. He had enlisted as George Hill. I have no idea why Willard Germain got ditched. I don't know why he picked George Hill. But now he's George Hill. He's in Northern California, and he's probably at the second battle of the stronghold of the Modoc War through the 17th. He was still, of course, in an artillery battery. Presumably, this means that he was, using a cannon against Indians. That's honestly about as delicately as I can put it. I don't know if that was the case, but what I do know is one story that made its way to me, which is he was out scouting with a friend of his. The Indians spotted them and chased them down, and George got away and his friend got scalped. So that's a very interesting story to make it down through some generations here, right? So after that war, discharged upon expiration of service as a sergeant on October 23rd, 1874 at Fort Stevens. And now he's out of the military. Now he is right there at Astoria. And now everything I knew in the beginning with the saloon and all the hijinks suddenly links up with before. Alright, since I know that this is a very disjointed mess, I want to rehash what I've learned in the beginning. And keep in mind, this took many years of research. By the way, on a side note, since I talk about DNA so often on this channel, DNA has verified that this guy is actually related to me. He is the real deal, because all this would be ultimately for nothing if he wasn't. But going from a piece of paper to sending a letter over here, and then a letter over here, and then a relative of a relative, it gets me more details. Put together this whole broad picture. We got a guy born in the Catskills, 1841, New York State. Nothing much happens of note, really, until 1862. He enlists in the Civil War from New York State. He ends up fighting in Louisiana, goes back home, re-enlists, and then re-enlists, and then re-enlists again under a fake name in Baltimore, of all places. Marries somebody, gets relocated by the military with his new name from Maryland to Oregon, ends up going down to Northern California to fight the Indians, goes back up there to Astoria, and ends up somehow getting a hold of a saloon and all kinds of... I mean, this guy had money and everything. I don't know if this guy was obsessed or just really good at it or what, but he had money and... good enterprises, bad enterprises, but of course the saloon is the memorable thing about him, and all of it finally comes together. So, the moral of the story, if there is one I guess, would be keep looking. if you hit a dead end, you never know who's going to have what. The information that you're looking for, somebody somewhere has it. It can be frustrating to look. But writing to Astoria was a gold mine. Lisa up there just blew this whole thing wide open with who this guy was in his second life, finding this cousin, the entire backstory. It all came together as a beautiful thing, and this is therefore one of my rock star ancestors. So I hope you got something out of this. I hope you enjoyed the story. I hope it encourages you to, try looking around for your own ancestors and sharing your own stories. So thank you for listening, and I'll be back soon.